I'm so honored to be able to introduce New York Public Service Commission Chair Rory Christian. Rory graduated from CCNY's Grove School of Engineering and received his MBA from Baruch College Zicklin School of Business. He began his career in the energy industry with private sector roles at Keyspan Energy and Exelon Energy, and then served as Director of Energy Finance and Sustainability at New York City Housing Authority, where he oversaw the authority's $500 million utility portfolio. Subsequently, he was the director of New York Clean Energy and Environmental Defense Fund, where he oversaw a multidisciplinary team of economists, lawyers, and engineers to design, implement, and manage legislative and policy campaigns to reduce the environmental impact of the energy system in New York. And I should note that I was one of the lawyers on Chair Christian's team at EDF. In 2021, Rory was appointed to the New York Public Service Commission, initially as a commissioner and subsequently as chair. Along the way, Chair Christian has also taught courses on energy efficiency and has served as chair of the board of We Act. Thank you so much for joining us today, Chair Christian.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you. Thank you. So after hearing that introduction, I think you're all thinking I know what I'm talking about, and I'm hoping over the next 30 minutes I don't dispel that notion. So again, my name is Rory Christian. I'm the chair of the Public Service Commission and also the CEO of the Department of Public Service. The role of the commission, we regulate all investor-owned utilities in the state of New York, and we also have some regulatory oversight over the Long Island Power Authority in Long Island. Now, I want to take the opportunity to thank NYU's Institute of Policy Integrity for having me today, and I want to also thank the previous panelists for a great discussion. Why don't we give them a quick round of applause? And again, I want to thank Elizabeth, Curtis, Allison, and others for making this event happen. Without their work, we would not be here. And thank you for everybody that's online this afternoon. So, again, I'm thankful to be here to speak with all of you, and I find myself in an interesting position. I like to give keynotes first thing in the morning as people enjoy their cup of coffee, start out the day. I find the ones right after lunch, I've got to work a little harder to keep everyone's attention. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach to what I would normally present, and I'm going to connect what we're doing today back to a book I've recently read, or am in the process of reading. Some of you know exactly what book I'm talking about because I think I talk about it in almost every instance when I meet. But the book in question is Fire Weather by John Vaillant. And no, I do not get proceeds from book sales. But I'm going to connect back to that book a number of things that we're going to talk about. And so today I want to frame our conversation around three things. First and foremost, I want to focus on context, the what and the why. Then I want to go into how we're going to get there. You've heard a bit of that earlier today. And then I'll close by talking about some of our long-term goals and the importance behind them and the strategies for getting there. And hopefully this will make your 4 CLEs worthwhile. So I read a lot. Between commission orders, FERC orders, correspondence, petitions, and a variety of other things, I go through several hundred pages. So personal reading is not something I really get to do a lot of. But one book, again, that I do go back on time and time again, that I'm still only halfway through because of all that other reading, is Fire Weather. And I bring this book up because it's an interesting overview of what we're going through right now. And it frames the discussion as a non-fictional account of the events that led to the Fort McMurray fire in Canada in 2016. Just show of hands, is anybody familiar with that fire from show of hands, please, thanks. I see some nodding heads. Not a lot of people are familiar with that fire. So I'm gonna go into a little background. So this fire began as a wildfire. It proceeded to consume millions of acres of forest land in Canada. Surprisingly limited loss of life, at least at this point in the book where I am. But what's interesting about this fire is this was the precursor to the fire that turned the orange skies of New York City orange a few months ago. And I bought the book the day the sky turned orange. Great marketing, by the way, from whoever their marketing company was. And in addition to the play-by-play of the events leading up to the fire, the author does a really interesting job discussing the physics and chemistry of fire, but also the various policy considerations that exacerbated the impact of the fire. And then where I am is he talks about the history of climate science, which I'm not going to get into too much, but again, really good read for anybody in the space, all of you here, worthwhile. So now in looking at this book, he describes humanity's relationship with fire in a way that I had not considered before. And it's something that upon realization I realize is actually pretty accurate. He characterizes it as if we were a global fire cult. I'm going to pause there for a second. I see some giggles, some of you understand, but I'll expand on why that's the case. Think about all the things you did to get here today. You turned on the lights in your home. That electricity, especially downstate, was probably driven by combustion. You took the train, you drove here, you flew here, combustion. In fact, the very clothes you're wearing are probably made from oils designed for combustion. When you think about everything that we do, whether directly or indirectly, there's a fire behind all those actions. And so in contextualizing fire in this story, he characterized us as a cult. And he characterized us in that way, and it makes me wonder how we think about the problem we're trying to solve. As mentioned earlier, I'm an engineer, so I often think about problems from a technical perspective. And to some of you who know me well, I'm a quasi-economist, so there's also the financial perspective. But I think we need to look beyond those two considerations and also think of it more from a spiritual perspective. Because when you think about fire and our relationship with it, it has been a part of humanity's progress since the first campfire, since the first torch, the steam engine, and everything beyond. Wherever we've gone, wherever we've tried to go, the fire has been involved. And so, in that context, what are we actually trying to accomplish? We're looking to electrify, and we're looking to decarbonize. So in essence, we're looking to move away from the entirety of human history and civilization. Our mastery of fire is so complete that for the day-to-day operations, we don't even realize how we use it and why. The average person simply flips a switch, pushes a button, turns a key, the car moves, the plane flies, the lights go on, the heat comes on. We're so good at it, we don't even realize it. So now we need to take that mastery, take that wizardry, and apply it in a completely different way. And the previous panel did a great job of explaining many of the challenges that will go into that. But I want to also highlight, again, spiritually, this is where we come from. We like to burn things. We always have. And we're trying to change that. And so to change that, we know we need to electrify. That is the pathway forward that we and many others have identified. And along that pathway, we know renewable energy will play an outsized role in getting us there. This is established as part of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which, by the way, is New York State law. Unlike other places, this is not so much a goal of achieving 70% renewable energy by 2030 and significant GHG reductions by 2050. These are enshrined in state law. So as an officer of the state of New York, it is my obligation and duty to do what I can to achieve these goals. And the CLCPA has enabled the Commission, through law, with the powers to do what's needed to get there. One example of this is the Clean Energy Standard, which I think many of you are familiar with. The Clean Energy Standard essentially puts forward a pathway towards achieving that 70 by 30. And it is a multi-pronged approach where we look at a variety of different resources in numerous contexts towards getting there. Tier 1 is all about land-based resources, utility-scale wind and solar and other assets. That's been going on for quite some time now. Tier 2, which is less talked about, is about preserving resources that otherwise would be exporting their renewable energy attributes outside of New York State. Now, Tier 2, again, not really heard of much, in part because we've been very successful in finding markets for those Tier 2 resources. This is primarily through our CCA programs, our community choice aggregation programs, which provide renewable energy resources directly to consumers, but also through our efforts to, sorry, I'm having a moment here. Well, primarily through our CCA and other efforts. But we've done a good job with Tier 1 and Tier 2. And for Tier 3, also known as our Zero Emissions Credit Program, this was designed with the recognition that our nuclear assets, primarily in upstate New York, are a valuable contributor to our overall state energy mix. Many of those resources were threatened with closure, and thus it was deemed appropriate to provide a financial incentive to continue their ongoing operation. And we do so through the Tier 3 program. And case in point to our friends from the DOE, it's such a good program that the federal government is copying it and doing something similar nationwide. Yay. Now, I've mentioned that much of our renewable energy development and much of our clean energy assets are in upstate New York. In fact, so much that the New York ISO highlighted the upstate-downstate divide and called it the tale of two grids. Upstate New York is roughly 90% emissions-free, and we think of that as a significant and an amazing accomplishment. But let's talk about the mechanics behind that. Where are we going to build in New York City a large-scale renewable energy deployment? Well, upstate was easier. The land was more available, the ability to interconnect to transmission easier, and those two things meant it was far cheaper and more efficient to deploy our early investments in upstate New York. And to this day, much of what we're doing through our Tier 1 and other efforts are through installations in upstate New York. But downstate is a different story. Downstate, roughly 80–90% of the mix is from fossil fuels, and we need to change that. So in recognition of this divide, we move forward with the Tier 4 program. And through this effort, we're pursuing options to develop resources that connect to the downstate region. Now, when we started this effort, the goal was twofold: to either build those resources downstate or build those resources somewhere else and connect them through transmission to the downstate region. For our first RFP, we received no options for deploying renewable energy resources downstate. Every option is to build it somewhere else and build a transmission connecting it to downstate New York. And this is not very unusual. In fact, if you look at most of the other countries in the world, when you're building an energy asset of any kind, it's usually further away from the urban core. So not too surprising. But the resulting projects, the Clean Path New York project and the Central Hudson Power Express, when they're completed and operational by 2030, they will significantly alter the generation mix of New York State and change how we look at this upstate-downstate divide. Now, going a step further, we're also looking at offshore wind. Now, by 2035, we have a goal of installing 9 gigawatts of offshore wind off Long Island and New York City. Now, with these resources, in conjunction with Tier 4, we're poised to achieve 79% renewable energy by 2030 if our efforts succeed. And that's a significant accomplishment and a significant progress towards our overall emissions reductions efforts. But as we build out these generation assets, we also need to keep in mind the need for transmission and distribution. We can build it, but we need to get the energy from point A to point B. And in doing so, we also need to make sure that future assets that come online, future generation resources, have an easier time connecting to the grid. Earlier, we talked about the interconnection process and the number of projects and the time it takes. Well, by building out transmission and distribution in areas where we know those developers are already seeking opportunities, we lay the groundwork to make those connections easier and more affordable. We lower the risk that these projects face, making them more likely to come online and ultimately making them more affordable for ratepayers. Now, over the last year, we've rolled out what has been the largest build-out of transmission infrastructure in the last 50 years. And our mandate for doing so was established through the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act. Our elected officials, recognizing the need to act proactively, directed us, the Commission, to take action and identify distribution and transmission upgrades that would be needed to make our 2030 goals and beyond a reality. And we have taken up the reins in devising plans and the funding and the allocation of expenditures with which to do so. And since this order is passed, we've approved roughly $4.5 billion in funding for near-term local transmission upgrades throughout the state. Again, these investments are going to allow us to capture the full benefit of future renewable resources as they come online. In addition to these, we've also taken steps to identify new transmission to support offshore wind, above and beyond what we've already identified. And we've outlined a planning process to produce a comprehensive and coordinated overview of system needs. Now, I could go on and on and on about the many other things that we're doing in the state. We're doing a great deal with electric vehicles. We have medium, heavy-duty electric vehicle planning underway. We have midpoint reviews to adjust and understand how we're moving in progress with all our efforts. We're also looking at something called a utility thermal energy network, which will ideally create thermal energy systems that could be used to help eliminate the need for combusting fossil fuels at sites and homes throughout the state. And these are just some of the many things that we're doing, in addition to what I've discussed. But everything we're doing, from the siting of generation to the deployment of pilots, has to take into consideration the equity and justice impacts of these efforts. Our energy system as we know it today has largely been built without taking into consideration the impacts on the communities in which they are sited. And the perfect example of this is a site not too far from here. And show of hands, is everyone familiar with the Ravenswood power plant? Great. Oh, a lot more. That's good. So for those of you unaware, Ravenswood was one of the largest power plants in the city of New York. Again, New York City's an interesting exception. When it was conceived and built in the 1960s, it was a coal-fired power plant, and it was built walking distance from New York City Housing Authority's Queensbridge projects, the largest at the time and still today. So just take that in mind. In the 1960s, it was perfectly appropriate to build a coal-fired power plant within walking distance of public housing. No problems. But you the counterfactual, the opposite of that, if you look at and compare that to Storm King, which I think many of you are very familiar with, this is a pumped hydropower station conceived and planned by Con Ed, Consolidated Edison, that would be built in the Storm King region upstate. It never got built. And the reason why? Because of the concern of environmental damage and the impact on fisheries and the effect of the natural environment. There's a disconnect there, right? And we need to recognize that as we go forward with our planning, we need to look at all that we do and make sure that the impacts do not negatively fall on one community, on one area. We need to make sure that our investments help everyone and that everyone can benefit from them. And so we're doing what we can to ensure we don't replicate mistakes of the past. Now going back to fire weather. A second point made in the book is all about infrastructure. And I know I've talked a lot about infrastructure now. I'll come to an end in a minute, I promise. But what was interesting about Fort McMurray, where the area affected by the fire, this was a very wealthy community. Booming oil industry, lots of well-paid individuals, significant economic growth. They had the best. They had the best water systems, fire systems, safety systems, roadways, you name it. But none of these things were built with the potential consideration of the type of fire that would emerge. Again, unprecedented in history. And when describing the events around the fire and how this infrastructure played a role, time and time again, what Valiant, the author, encountered was the infrastructure couldn't handle the crisis that was in front of people. The community was overcome by events, ultimately, and the fire spread uncontrolled. So how do we take lessons learned from situations like that, where we see an emerging threat happening, we try to plan for it, but it exceeds all potential frames for what we consider an emergency to be? Well, the interesting thing is we've had our own version of that, and that was Hurricane Sandy. When Hurricane Sandy hit, it exceeded all previous records for flooding in New York City, to the point where we've invested billions of dollars in flooding protection and hardening of utility infrastructure in the downstate region. And for those of you who live in New York and were here a couple weeks ago during the Noah's Ark flood, I think those investments came in handy and will likely continue to pay us dividends in reliability and resiliency for years to come. So I think about this and I recognize we know what's coming. We know that our current system will face increasing challenges from climate change. We know that the severity and frequency of these events will grow and grow over time, and we're just now beginning to see how they will grow over time. But in addition, there are a few other things to understand that I think don't often get discussed. Three things that change how we look at risk. First, there's a lot more of us. When our systems were built, no one, I think, expected the kind of growth that we've achieved over the last 50, 60 years. We have more houses, more cars, simply more assets, which means more at risk. Second, let's think about how those assets have spread out. Where I grew up in Brooklyn, there was a community across the street. We were right next to a swamp, a literal swamp, mind you. No one would build there because who builds on a swamp? Well, now there's a thriving community with mid-rise buildings. Hundreds, thousands of people live there. And we see situations like that replicated time and time again. Places where people could not build are now buildable. People are taking the risk. So we have more assets, and we're building in places that were previously considered marginal at best. And then third, our infrastructure was never built with these threats in mind. So we've got more assets, we have them in more difficult places, more challenging situations, and we have an infrastructure paradigm that did not take into consideration the increasing levels of risk. So we need to really think about these things and take them into consideration as we move forward. And much of what we're doing, all of what we're doing, is taking these things into consideration. The fact is, we cannot rely on the system that we've had for the past 50, 60, 70 years. We need to adapt, to adjust, and have a system that is far more flexible, far more resilient than anything that we've had. Relying on a single large generator, a single point of failure, is a risk that we need to think differently about. And thinking about the idea of having each and everybody in this room as part of the health and well-being of the grid, I think that is the future. Forget the terminology that was used earlier, but having the customers be a part of the solution rather than the demand on the system. That is the paradigm we are moving towards. Because when we all work together, we can be more resilient and more robust. So I recognize I'm preaching to the audience here. You've heard all this before. But for those of you who don't believe that equity and equality should be part of what we're doing, or that climate change isn't really a thing, the other thing to keep in mind is the single most powerful force known to man, consumer action. And for that, I want to ask, if you have a cell phone, would you be so kind as to hold it up? Thank you very much. I'm a big fan of audience participation, if you haven't figured that out. So 20 years ago, if I'd asked this question, would have seen a couple of Motorola Razrs and a few pagers. That's 20 years ago, all right? And that's about as much time as we have to make this transition. And yes, they are different. But consumer action plays a big role in what we do, why we do it, and how. And when you think about the grid from that perspective, you recognize the fact that the grid of old was built to manage consumer action, right? We talk about it from the supply side and the demand side. Just the terminology in and of itself hints at that. The grid is designed to handle our demands, whatever those demands may be. Well, we're changing how the grid works so that the grid and us can work together so we can be a unified whole rather than one part serving another. Now, as we do this, the reason for being proactive is important because we recognize we cannot control consumer action. Now, I'm not going to ask how many of you own EVs. We're in New York City, so not expecting a lot of hands. But EV growth in the city and the state has grown significantly. Articles in the Times the past couple of weeks highlighting that 200% EV growth year over year. That's been amazing. I don't think we planned for that. In fact, I know we didn't plan for that. We're looking to see how we can revise our plans to take that into account. But that's the kind of growth that we are taking steps to prepare for and manage. And doing anything short of proactive action, knowing what's coming, is ultimately going to be labeling us as irresponsible. So, looking at all these things, the need for action is why we are here today. We've known about the studies that highlight that renewable energy alone will not be sufficient to meet the full range of reliability needs that will arise, particularly as we start using less fossil fuel generation. And based on current technology, based on changing patterns in demand, that gap in capabilities and future system reliability and requirements is apparent. So through the order, the zero emissions order that we're discussing today, the Commission seeks out a variety of pathways to address that shortfall. And as a first step, we're looking for input from stakeholders like you. We want to understand what those options are and what your perspectives are on how we can achieve our goals. And one key thing that we'll need to understand is how do we define what we consider to be zero emissions? Depending on who you talk to, it could be hydrogen, combusted or not. It could be RNG. Some have strong feelings on either side. But ultimately, in establishing this definition, we will set the path for how we will proceed with addressing the need for dispatchable emissions-free resources going forward. Now, our ability to do this is enshrined in law, the public service law, in fact. We've been directed to establish a program to achieve the various goals established by the CLCPA. And I'm going to read from the law here. Quote, the Commission is directed to consider, and where applicable, formulate the programs to address impacts of the programs on safe and adequate electric service in the state under reasonably foreseeable conditions. So again, to reiterate, we know it's coming. We know what we need to do, and we, at the Commission, have been empowered with the ability to find a path forward. So I appreciate you all being here today to be a part of this discussion, and I look forward to the questions to come. And I do hope all of you are engaged in our proceeding and providing comments and feedback, because it is through your voice, through your input, that we can take the best action in the benefit of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Christian. And I just want to flag, I think toward the end you were referring to a current comment opportunity, correct?
Yes, it's a very current comment opportunity. Yes.
So yeah, there is a request for comment out in the relevant docket 15-E-0302 right now. And I think the comments are due in January for anyone who needs to know that. Thank you so much for those far-reaching remarks. Really appreciate it. Does anyone know how we are for time? Because I want to make sure that I get in a couple questions, but we also have time for audience questions. 19, okay, great. In the earlier panel and also in your remarks, the sense of sort of the need for a break from the past has come up, that the system wasn't built for what we needed to do now. And utilities practices kind of have evolved around an old world that doesn't exist anymore, including that they are accustomed to, not just the electric utilities, are accustomed to delivering natural gas, and the price systems and rate structures are sort of rooted in a world that we're not in anymore. And I'm wondering what you're thinking about how utility regulators like yourself, can ensure that their regulated entities are not overly focused on the status quo, business as usual, where a real break from that is necessary to decarbonize or to provide relief to communities that are already overburdened.
You always ask the hard questions. So I could answer this many ways, and I'll try to high level and then dive into a few details. So it was mentioned earlier the need for incentives. We at the Commission have some things called earnings adjustment mechanisms and negative revenue adjustments. One gives you more money, the other takes money away. And the goal of that is to align utility behavior with overarching state and policy and Commission direction. The EAMs and the NRAs vary by utility, and we want to size them appropriately to ensure that the actions utilities take drive the outcomes we desire and are sufficient to reward them for the effort needed to get there. Case in point, interconnection. So we have a standard interconnection requirement for assets that want to connect to the grid and provide energy. That is something we've standardized over many years, and we're working with the utilities to ensure that they are not an impediment to assets that want to interconnect on their local grid. We have earnings adjustment mechanisms for many of the utilities to encourage them to work with that goal in mind. That's just one example. Further, to ensure that we're sizing our operations internally to meet our goals, we've taken many steps to shore up various offices within the Commission and our sister agencies. As many of you know, we work very closely with the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Many of you may not be aware of the recently created Office of Renewable Energy Siting, which again was signed and deployed specifically to help accelerate the deployment of renewable energy siting throughout the state of New York. So we recognize we need to have the utilities aligned, and we have the infrastructure in place to make that alignment easier. We recognize also internally we need to adjust our own operations, both as a commission, but also with our sister agencies, to facilitate the outcomes that we have. And I'd say, in addition to those two, we also recognize things change at different paces. Commission proceedings happen on a fairly regular basis, but once they begin, 2, 3, 4 years may pass before word is heard again as to what progress has been made. We've instituted a policy of putting in midpoint reviews on most of the things that we engage in to ensure that 3 years later, technology hasn't progressed to the point where we should completely rethink what we're doing, or consumer adoption rates have changed in a manner where our original assumptions are no longer valid. So these are just some examples of how we try to work together to align the outcomes with utility practices and our own actions.
That's great. Before I ask anything further, I think I failed to say that those note cards that are on your table are still on your tables, and that audience questions would be very welcome, and some of my colleagues can pick those up from you. Along, I think, somewhat similar lines, the jurisdiction over the electric system is split between federal and state regulators, and New York has required distribution utilities to give up their generation assets, and portions of the system are not directly subject to your oversight. And to what extent have you found that the various regulatory frameworks, including state and federal energy regulators as well as environmental regulators, are working effectively in support of one another's goals? And to what extent are you finding them to be at cross purposes?
That is such a loaded question, Elizabeth.
Sorry. Didn't mean a loaded question.
How many more? You're like swinging here. I'm loving this. So this is an interesting question in part because we in many ways we do work very well together, but as mentioned earlier, you know, this is the federal jurisdiction, this is the state's jurisdiction, and you know, we don't try to necessarily step on each other's toes. I think that's probably one of the easiest ways to answer that question. And
you want to leave it at that?
No, because there's more. So I think one thing that's ongoing right now, which I'll talk about at a very high level because we are currently engaged in court action, the demand curve reset. So for those of you unfamiliar with this, this is something done by the New York ISO. Several years ago, sorry, let me provide more context. So the demand curve reset, what it does is it looks at what is the next nth generator likely to come online to meet system needs, right? So it could be we need a nuclear power plant because the system needs are growing, or it could be a peaker plant. And historically, it's been a peaker plant, just that's the incremental unit. And the cost of that plant, the ideal proxy plant, is used to estimate certain costs for the system. I'm paraphrasing in a big way, but I'm trying to keep it high level. Several years ago, that plant would be advertised over 30 years. In the past, it was lowered to 20. Now you're thinking, okay, what's the big difference? Well, if you're paying something over 30 years, you're paying less per year than if you're paying over 20. So that change through FERC ultimately led to higher prices in New York. That 30 to 20 year change. That is a disconnect. We don't agree. But it gets better. They recently changed it from 20 years to 17. So you can imagine the costs are going even higher. So you can imagine where things are going, and this is in part driven, according to FERC, by the state's climate policies. If the marginal generator is a peaker plant, and that's what technology allows, and peaker plants are not allowed to be operational by 2030, then you're only going to amortize it over 17 years, not 20, not 30. So we're trying to come into alignment with our federal counterparts on how best to do this on an ongoing basis. But that's just one example of many where we don't necessarily agree eye to eye and what the impacts of that disagreement can be.
That's excellent. Thank you. I'm going to ask one more of my own questions before I move on to these excellent questions, but I really wanted to ask you this one, which is that some of the zero-emission generation technologies that are currently under discussion for meeting New York's zero-emission goals are not guaranteed by their nature to be zero emissions, as was discussed in the guardrails discussion earlier. Wondering if you have thoughts that you'd like to share on how the risk that they underperform in terms of their emissions performance should be managed.
This is the easiest one.
Okay, good.
So we have a proceeding in which this is being actively discussed, and we are looking at the feedback received, and we're taking all of those points into consideration in making what will ultimately be our determination in the future. Exactly where we will end up is to be determined. But again, we're trying to make sure that we look at all aspects of what is commercially and technically feasible today, but we also recognize that what's available today will likely change 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. So we're trying to be equal parts prescriptive and be clear on what we mean by zero emissions, but not so prescriptive as to rule out potential future technologies that may become available over time. So this is, for lack of a better word, an iterative process that will evolve, and this is the first step on that process. So again, all feedback is welcome and will be taken into consideration.
And that's that same proceeding. So
That's that exact same. What was that number again?
It was 15-E-0302.
There we go.
So these are great questions received from the audience. What is the PSC doing to effectuate peak pricing and demand response in a timely fashion?
Okay. So there are many ways to answer this question, and I'll start at the root. So peak pricing and demand response. Key part of being able to do peak pricing and demand response is having the appropriate metering infrastructure in place. Much of the metering throughout the state of New York is pretty much technologically unchanged since the 1980s, 1990s. A person shows up, reads the meter, drives away. In some cases, they've been advanced with communications technology that allows them to talk to a van a block away as it drives down. We've had such significant advances in communication technology over the past few years that we're pushing in a direction where you should be able to, for most utilities in the state, at least the ones that we regulate, in the near future, to look at your phone, log in, and see in real time how much energy you've used. And for those of you who are Con Ed customers, most of you should already be able to do that at this point. So this is step one in providing the infrastructure to make sure that we can expand the capabilities of time-variant pricing, time-flexible pricing, and demand response capabilities to everyday individuals in this room, in your homes. Now, these technologies have long been available for commercial and industrial customers. In fact, in my prior life, one of my roles was to hand deliver the demand response checks to companies that participated. And I'm going to tell you something. People will open the door and wave you in when you are carrying a $20,000 check. And it was a great feeling. I felt like I had a cape on. But imagine that feeling if you are in a position as individuals to benefit in the same way, right? There are a number of providers today that offer some version of demand response. I'm not going to name them. If you go to your local utilities website and you type in demand response, you'll see stuff. But you have separate devices that you can use for individual appliances. You can use your meter that's currently there, but ultimately you'll get an alert saying use less energy. And if you use less energy, not only are you saving money on your bill, but you may get some additional incentive above and beyond that. The platform I've used, I think we've collected $35 this year. It's not a fortune, but it's $35. And I know everyone in my family is aware of it. Like, we don't do the laundry when we're alerted not to. We turn the TV off. We go outside. These are things that are part of what I mentioned earlier about the need for us to be engaged in the future health and well-being of the grid. If we can make sure everyone can get these price signals in a timely manner, and that the price signals are such that each person responds in a manner that actually solicits the results needed, we won't necessarily need to build out renewable energy to the degree that we have planned, right? Because much of our planning, much of our thinking assumes certain changes in efficiency, but not necessarily behavior. And so when I think of the future of where we need to go, the success of this build out of renewable energy, transmission, EVs, all these things, it comes down to each and every individual and making sure that we can each benefit by changing our behavior from what it currently is today.
Thanks, that's great. I think for the next question that we got from the audience, I'm actually going to combine with something I had in mind anyway, which is the interaction between the gas system and the electric system, both of which are under your jurisdiction. That, you know, it cuts in both directions, right? Because we have gas serving power plants, and we also have power replacing gas burnt at customer premises as we move to clean heating technologies of various types. Wondering how you're thinking about that in terms of co-optimization of the planning of those two systems, or any other ramification of that relationship that you would be inspired to want to discuss.
This sounds entirely like a you question, Elizabeth. I don't know.
No, it was not exclusively a me question. I promise.
Well, this is a good one. So this is the thing that keeps me up at night. If that's a question coming later, I'm going to preempt that. The need to ensure that we properly coordinate our planning of the gas and the electric systems is one of the single most important things. For individuals who are gas and electric customers, the impact can be quite significant. Imagine for a moment we're upgrading, managing, and modernizing the electric system, and there are costs coming with that. If we do the same with the gas system to the same degree, there are costs coming with that. Do you want both? Do you need both? That is an existential question to what we're trying to do. Now, with the gas system, there are many sides to this conversation. There are some who think we should be ripping pipe out of the ground. We should never put in another gas main. We shouldn't replace leak-prone pipe. That's one extreme. And then there are others who think we should expand the system to allow more gas. That's the other side. The reality of the situation is the gas system is something we've invested multiple billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in to maintain and operate. And there's a significant degree of utility in that system, and we must keep it functional. So to do that, you have to maintain it. You have to invest in it. And the analogy I like to use is you own a car that you're planning to sell in a few years. You don't abandon the car if you get a flat. You change the tire. You maintain the vehicle for as long as you use it, and that's what we're looking to do with the gas system. So our challenge is how do we size the necessary investments needed to properly maintain the gas system in this time of transition where we're putting greater demands on the electric system. Now, analysis after analysis, some done by Brattle, show that the transition will ultimately lead to lower costs for consumers who use natural gas and electric, because now they have a single bill, a single meter, a single source for energy efficiency, and they can better manage their costs down over time rather than having two separate. We've also looked at this from the perspective of the Commission's energy affordability approach, where we have, my predecessors, established a 6% income cap as an energy burden. So if you imagine an individual, 6% of their income is what they should spend on energy. How do you manage that if you have a gasoline vehicle, an oil boiler, and electricity? You've got three separate utilities. But if you're fully electrified, your car gets electric, your heating is electric, everything else, that's a lot easier to manage and do something about with that 6% affordability target. So a lot of what we're trying to do here takes all this into consideration: the managing of the system, the growth, the managing of the gas system, the potential growth on the electric system, the managing of all the costs associated with all of the above, and then ensuring affordability so that we don't price people out of using either. All of these are challenges we're trying to overcome. And on the gas side, we have a gas planning proceeding. I do not have the number memorized, but Google is your friend. But your engagement in that proceeding, for those interested, again, also helpful. We have utilities that are putting forward their long-term gas plans, which each individual utility with its own unique circumstances is looking what will they need to do to manage their system during this period of transition, and some interesting reading there for those interested. Thank you.
Chair Christian, that was fantastic. I think we're at time, basically. So I had another one, and I'll spare you. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and spending time with us today. And I appreciate you being here. I hope you'll stay for the remainder of the
I'll stick around.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.